For my entire career analyzing global stability, the United States State Department has been the one issuing the warnings. We are used to seeing the US government tell its citizens not to go to Russia, not to go to Iran, not to go to North Korea. We are used to the American superpower pointing at a map and designating danger zones for the safety of its people. But I want you to look at what just happened on the northern border, because the script has been flipped. The map has been inverted. For the first time in modern history, the warning is not coming from the United States. It is being issued against the United States. Multiple sovereign nations within the Canadian borders have effectively declared the USA a hostile zone for their citizens. They have issued formal red alert advisories. The message is simple. It is terrifying, and it marks the end of the North American relationship as we knew it. Do not cross the border. Do not go south. The United States is no longer safe for you. This is not a travel tip about long lines or currency exchange rates. This is a warning about survival. We are witnessing the collapse of the longest undefended border in the world, and it is being replaced by a militarized dragnet that does not care about your history, your treaties, or your citizenship. If you think this is just about a few unlucky travelers getting stopped for an extra hour, you are missing the massive geopolitical shift happening right under our noses. I have been tracking the movements of Border Kazar Tom Homan and the new enforcement protocols, and I can tell you that what is happening in Minnesota and Washington state is not routine. It is a siege, and the victims of this siege are the very people who have held the right to cross these lines for over 200 years. To understand why this is a historic crisis, we have to look at the trigger. It starts with a piece of paper that is supposed to be untouchable, the Jay Treaty of 1794. For 2 centuries, this treaty guaranteed that Indigenous peoples could move freely between the US and Canada. It wasn't a perk, it was a recognition that these nations existed before the border did. It meant that for an Indigenous person, that line on the map was effectively invisible. You could cross for work, for family, for trade, or just to have dinner. That treaty is now dead on the ground. Reports are flooding in from the Okanagan Nation Alliance, the Huayat First Nations, and the Upper Nicola Band. Their citizens are attempting to cross into the U.S. using their federally issued Canadian status cards, documents that prove who they are and their right to cross. But instead of a wave through, they are meeting a stone wall. Emboldened ICE agents and Border Patrol officers are looking at these sovereign documents, looking at the people holding them, and rejecting them. They are pulling these travelers into secondary interrogation. They are confiscating IDs. They are throwing people into detention cells that communications officers are describing as not even good enough for a jail. And the terrifying part is the logic being used. These agents are reportedly telling Indigenous Canadians that the United States does not recognize their documents anymore. Think about the weight of that. A Canadian federal ID recognized by Ottawa is being treated as scrap paper by U.S. agents just a few feet across the line. The reaction has been immediate and unprecedented. The Okanagan Nation Alliance urged its members to use extreme caution, explicitly stating that the U.S. administration's unpredictable arrest and detention practices are a direct threat. Diana Moffat from the Upper Nicola Band was even more blunt. She isn't telling her people to be careful, she is telling them to stay home. She said, "My fear is that they will be detained. It is better to stay home safe as opposed to taking the risk." This is the language we usually hear during a war or a pandemic or a diplomatic breakdown with a rogue state. We do not hear this between Canada and the USA, but we are hearing it now because the rules of the game have changed overnight. I want to dig into the why because this isn't an accident. This isn't a few rogue agents having a bad day. This is a systemic shift in how the United States views its neighbors. We have to talk about Tom Homan, the border czar. While the media is distracted by the southern border with Mexico, Homan has been quietly militarizing the north. We know that Operation Metro Surge in Minnesota was a testing ground. We saw thousands of arrests. And even though there was a headline recently about Homan withdrawing 700 agents, you have to read the fine print. That was a PR move. Even after that withdrawal, 2,000 federal agents remain in Minnesota alone. That is a massive standing army for a border that is supposed to be friendly. These agents are operating under a new mandate. It is a guilty until proven innocent mindset. If you look foreign, if you present a card they don't like, or if you simply don't fit the profile of what they think a tourist looks like, you are a target. The most disturbing aspect of this new enforcement is the resurrection of blood quantum laws. This is something that sounds like it belongs in the 19th century, but it is happening right now at the border crossings in Washington and Minnesota. ICE agents are reportedly demanding that Indigenous Canadians prove they have 50% American Indian blood. This is a United States metric. It is not how Canadian First Nations define themselves. Canadian status cards do not list your blood percentage because that is not how citizenship works in Canada. But US agents are demanding it anyway. Imagine the scene. You are a Canadian citizen. You have your government ID. You have a treaty right from 1794. And an armed US agent tells you that unless you can produce a long form birth certificate or a letter proving your genetic blood quantum on the spot, you are an illegal alien. You are detained. You are put in a cell. And because you are technically a foreign national in their eyes, you have no rights. This is why the advisory was issued. The Huayot First Nations had to tell their people, if you are going to the US, do not rely on the Jay Treaty, do not rely on your rights. Carry a Canadian passport, pretend you are just a regular tourist. Because if you try to assert your rights, the US government will crush you. This leads us to the biggest loser in this entire situation. And it is not who you think, it is Canada itself. We are witnessing a humiliating sovereignty crisis for the Canadian federal government. A passport or a national ID card is the property of the government that issues it. It is a symbol of the state's power. When you hand that card to a foreign agent, you are protected by the weight of your government. But right now, the United States is taking Canadian government documents and saying, these mean nothing to us. In Ottawa, Ottawa is silent. The Canadian federal government is failing to protect the validity of its own citizenship documents. If a Canadian status card is worthless in the US, then Canadian sovereignty is being eroded in real time. When a superpower ignores your official documents, you are no longer a partner. You are a vassal state. You are a subordinate. The US is sending a message that they determine who is Canadian and who isn't based on their own arbitrary rules about blood and paperwork. The emotional toll here is devastating. We are talking about families being torn apart. We are talking about the erasure of identity. For these First Nations, the border is an artificial line drawn through their living rooms. They have family on both sides. They have cultural sites on both sides. The SIDXW and Lakapamux Assembly had to cancel their trip to the Celebrating Salish Conference, a massive cultural gathering, because it simply wasn't safe to travel. John Allen Jack, the chief of the Huayot First Nations, said it clearly. We expect the Jay Treaty is not always known or respected by ICE agents. That is a polite way of saying that the law enforcement of the United States has gone rogue. They are either ignorant of the law, or more likely, they have been instructed to ignore it in favor of border security. But there is a darker, more cynical layer to this. Why would the US government want to detain people who are obviously not a security threat? Why harass people who have been crossing for decades? Follow the money? The U.S. private prison complex is a massive industry. Detention centers get paid per head. A confused border is a profitable border. If ICE starts detaining Canadians and Indigenous people for illegal entry because they don't accept their ID cards, those people have to go somewhere. They go to detention. The contractors who run these facilities bill the federal government. It is a machine that needs to be fed. By expanding the definition of illegal to include Indigenous people with valid treaty rights, the system creates a new stream of customers for the detention industry. It sounds conspiratorial until you look at the sheer number of agents and the expansion of facilities in the northern states. They are building capacity. You don't build capacity unless you plan to fill it. And then there is the political optic. For the Trump administration and Border Khazar Homan, this is pure political dominance. They are tearing up international norms to show their voter base that they control every inch of the territory. It makes the US look tough. It sends a message that international rules, even ones as old as the Jay Treaty, do not apply to American soil anymore. They are showing that they can do whatever they want and Canada will just take it. However, there is a consequence that I don't think the US planners have fully calculated. They are looking at this as a security operation, but they are forgetting the economics. Border towns survive on this traffic. Small towns in Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Minnesota rely on Canadians driving south to buy gas, milk, groceries, and retail goods. These warnings effectively act as sanctions on U.S. businesses. When the Okanagan Nation Alliance says, do not travel, that means millions of dollars in revenue stay in Canada. We are already seeing reports of job sites closing and fear spreading in these communities. Diana Moffat mentioned that families are being torn apart, job sites are closing, the economic freeze is setting in. If this continues, the northern U.S. border towns will become ghost towns, but the federal government in Washington, D.C. doesn't care about a gas station in Blaine or a grocery store in International Falls. They care about the narrative of the Iron Wall. Now, I want you to look forward because this situation is escalating fast. The warning from the First Nations is just the canary in the coal mine. If the U.S. continues to enforce this guilty until proven innocent standard, we are going to see the paper wall expand. Today, they are rejecting Indigenous status cards. Tomorrow, what stops them from rejecting Canadian driver's licenses? What stops them from demanding long-form birth certificates for every single Canadian traveler? We are moving toward a reality where the era of driving across with a wave is over. The US is building a system where every entry requires extreme vetting. We could see a future where the US demands a pre-approved visa or travel authorization, like the ESTA system used for Europe, for all Canadians. This would fundamentally destroy the integrated economy of North America. But there is an even more volatile scenario on the horizon: retaliation. We have to remember that Indigenous communities in Canada control key strategic infrastructure. Rail lines, highways, and pipelines run through their territories. We have seen in the past that when these nations are pushed into a corner, they have the power to shut down the Canadian economy. If the US continues to arrest and detain their people, we could see blockades, not at the border, but inside Canada. Imagine if US-bound trains carrying lumber, oil, or minerals are stopped on the tracks. Imagine if the highways feeding the border crossings are blocked. This turns a border issue into a full-blown trade war. This is the pressure cooker we are watching. The US is pushing, thinking there is no cost, but the cost is building up in the anger of communities that have been pushed too far. The terrifying reality is that the mechanisms for resolving this, diplomacy, mutual respect, treaty law, are being dismantled. The red alert is not just a travel advisory, it is a declaration that trust has collapsed. When I look at the footage of agents in Minnesota, when I read the reports of elders being detained and interrogated about their bloodlines, I don't see a security operation. I see a power play. I see a superpower flexing its muscles simply because it can. And for the traveler, for you, watching this, the implication is clear. The border you thought you knew is gone. It has been replaced by a militarized zone where your papers might work, or they might not, depending on the mood of the agent and the color of your skin. The Canadian government's silence is deafening, but the message from the First Nations is loud and clear. They are the only ones telling the truth about what is happening down there. They are the only ones willing to say that the land of the free has become a danger zone for their people. As we watch this unfold, the question isn't just about whether you can go to Target in Buffalo or take a trip to Seattle. The question is whether Canada, as a nation, can stand up for its own citizens, because right now the evidence suggests it cannot. The Jay Treaty survived the War of 1812, it survived the Civil War, it survived two world wars, but it looks like it might not survive this administration. And if that treaty falls, if that recognition of pre-existing rights is erased, then the border becomes something else entirely. It becomes a wall, and walls by their very nature are designed to keep people out, no matter who they are or what papers they hold. We are watching history being rewritten in the most aggressive way possible. The US is closing in on itself, and it is dragging its neighbors into the chaos. This is a developing situation that is changing by the hour. The advisories are still in place. The agents are still there. The risk is real. I will keep monitoring the specific detention numbers coming out of Minnesota and the legal challenges that are bound to rise from this violation of international law. But for now, the map remains inverted. The warning stands.